This is our first coffee conversation together, I think.
I know. Okay. Hello. Hello. Welcome to another amazing coffee conversation. I am joined today with our fantastic Reiki Cafe University professor, Shantel. Shantel, thank you so much for joining me today.
Good morning. I'm looking forward to this. This is our first time to have a chat on our coffee conversation. I'm looking forward to it.
Yes. Yeah, you guys have seen us in all different configurations of myself and Christine or Chantel and Christine or us together. And this is our first time having myself and Chantel, which is really exciting. So today we're going to be talking about grief and the heart chakra. This is a huge topic, especially as we're moving into the holidays and things like that. But before we dive in, I'd love to give everybody a couple minutes to kind of wander in here. And I'd love to know where you're from, what you're drinking, all of that good stuff. I am in Tennessee. I'm back in Tennessee for those of you who've been following my travels. I've had quite a few life transitions recently, and I'm back in Tennessee to kind of celebrate those. And I am just drinking water today because I had coffee this morning and didn't want to overload my system. So just water for me today.
Well, it's an interesting jug that you're drinking water out of.
Yeah, I know. Isn't it cute? It's like this
It
big
is.
pink. You can't really tell. It's like a really pale pink, and it has a little cap that goes on it. I love it. It's great.
Oh, cute. Looks like a little vase, kind of. Looks
Yeah,
like
I
it
know. It
belongs on the
doesn't
shelf
fit
in the
in
back.
any cup holder. It's incredibly impractical, but I love it.
Yeah, good deal. So, back in Tennessee right now, huh?
Back in Tennessee. Yeah, I got engaged, which I'm
Yay,
unofficially announcing
congratulations.
here. I'm doing, yeah, big transitions, and I'll be doing some live videos in the group this week to kind of talk through that process. But I did, I got engaged, and my fiance's here in Tennessee. And so we're here for a while until we figure out what we want to do. So, yeah, big transitions, but it's exciting.
That is exciting. All heart chakra based stuff. So good stuff.
Yes. Very heart chakra based today, which kind of leads us right into our coffee conversation today. So, today we're talking about heart chakra. We're talking about all of the different aspects of heart chakra, but really focusing in on the process of grief, because grief is an emotion and is a process that I don't think it's talked about very much. And when it does, it's usually in the context of death or transition or that kind of thing. And so today we really want to kind of touch on how grief shows up in the heart chakra and all of the different ways that it can show up, as well as honoring that the holidays can be a really intense time of grief for a lot of people and can bring up a lot of heart chakra based emotions in addition to grief. And so, really looking at all of those and honoring those today. And so, if you're in a space where you're feeling really overwhelmed, whether it's because of the holidays or it just happens to coincide with this time of year, then you've come to the right place. And I'm so honored to be joined with Shantel today because she specifically has grief centered practices in her Reiki practice. And so she's a fantastic voice to be able to share this conversation with. So, Shantel, I'm really excited to have this conversation today. Do you want to kick us off?
Sure. So like you're talking, there's different especially going into the holidays, being around our family, recognizing the seats that are empty, when that's typically what you think about with grief is who's not there when you have a family gathering. Um, but really working through the heart chakra and recognizing what our grief is and how it feels and honoring it so that we can move through it, not just over it, because a lot of times people go, well, you need to get over that, but it doesn't really work that way. So just having the honor and the time and space for each of us. So I'm really excited to have this conversation that we can just open up maybe a different way of looking at grief or techniques on how to work through it for our listeners while they're preparing for all of their family gatherings and everything.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of my favorite aspects of the heart chakra is because, we always talk about heart chakra in the context of love and connection and companionship and empathy and all of these things. But one of my personal favorite aspects of heart chakra is its ability to introduce harmony into our lives. And that idea that there is no one size fits all answer, and that there is going to be this process of balance in everything we do. And so, yes, there are times, especially if we're looking at grief through the context of holidays and that process of grief, there are going to be times where we have to continue on through the day even when it's hard. And then there are also going to be times where we can sit and we can process and we can feel, and it's that balance, that harmony of being able to be present with your emotions and knowing when it's time to process them and when it's time to just let them exist, and finding that flow and being really gentle with yourself through the process. Because I think there is a really strong tendency, just as human beings, and even from a psychological perspective, of really wanting to just, when we have a strong emotion, we want to hide from it. We want to run away. We want to shove it down because it's so much easier. And I think grief is a fantastic emotion to kind of illustrate the fact that we don't have to run away. It doesn't have to be scary to face those emotions. If we do it in a really conscious and spiritually minded way, we can really embrace that emotion and embrace what it's there to tell us. And particularly when we're talking about grief around the holidays, like Shantel said, there's going to be that grief, especially if you've recently lost a loved one, or if there's always just kind of that heaviness around the holidays because maybe there's someone that's not there. I know in my family we have a lot of that heavier energy, particularly from my mother's father, because our grandmother's not present at the table anymore and things like that. And so there's just this, there's this subtle awareness, even if you've healed from it, even if you've gone through the process of healing and feeling those emotions, there's always going to be this subtle awareness that there was a potential here that wasn't fulfilled. And I think this is really where I'd love to open our conversation on grief. Is one of my favorite definitions of grief is it's an expression of all of the love that we didn't get to express. And what I love about that definition of grief is it's so applicable in so many different situations, right? Because we don't just grieve when we've lost a person. We can grieve when we lose a thing, or when we lose a job, or when we lose part of ourselves. And I remember the first time that I ever really experienced really intense grief in my life, it actually wasn't with a person. And that was a really interesting process because it was, I've mentioned on the show before that I grew up training to be a classical ballet dancer, and then I got really, really sick, and I had to let it go in order to essentially stay alive and stay healthy. And the process of losing that thing that had been my entire life and basically my entire identity, it was a process of grieving. And when I heard that phrase about how grief is just the love that we didn't get to express, it really helped kind of start the cycle of healing in me, because instead of feeling so stuck in the loss of something or in what I didn't have anymore, it then became this process of, no, I just have so much love that I can figure out how to express it and what to do with it in a positive and constructive way. And I feel like looking at grief from that angle can take some of the sting out of it. It can take some of the hardship out of grief, because instead of it being fully focused on loss and on that hole that has been left behind, it now becomes focused on what we could fill that hole with, and this love that we do have to give, and all of these positive things that until we have that realization, we haven't known what to do with, or we haven't been aware of. And so we have felt empty. And it's switching into realizing that grief is not an empty emotion. Grief is a very full experience if we allow it to be.
Yes, it really is. And I think because we recognize the emptiness in us when somebody does transition, it's sometimes, especially in the beginning, it's very difficult to see what that space can be filled with. And so it is becoming aware of ourselves. It's not comparing our journey with anyone else, even if we, like love the same person. We each, everyone has a different relationship. Maybe that's my son and it's your brother or your friend or whatever, kind of thing. And so really not comparing and thinking, well, I should be over something because this person already is, or they're moving through their grief in a different way. So it really is recognizing the individual journey that we're on as we're processing grief, and to recognize that also each relationship that we have is going to represent a different level of grief, a different kind of grief, depending on the relationship that you had, or like you're talking identity of things that we've lost. And people who have gone through like a lot of inner child, like childhood trauma, that also is a grief when you're grieving like a certain period of your life or a phase in your life where you feel like you weren't fulfilled in that. So there is a lot that happens with that. And I think like you're saying, when we have somebody like your grandfather who is far grieving your grandmother and there's that emptiness that you feel, then there's almost like we also feel as the observers of those who are grieving, like we need to help them fill that space. Like, I'm going to come over and I'm going to help you. And sometimes we don't even need that. Sometimes it's really like you're saying, sitting with ourselves, feeling what our emotions are, and allowing our own healing to transpire, to come in and let that all happen. What are our downloads? What are our messages? What is our purpose with this process? So there's a lot of layers to what grief represents.
Yeah, absolutely. And I feel like that idea of what can we learn from this experience is so important, especially like you said, when we are in the part of an observer, because particularly, if we're in the spiritual realm and we are Reiki practitioners, we do have that tendency towards wanting to help and wanting to be present and wanting to fix the things. And so there becomes this question of, respecting the autonomy of the person that's going through the process and noticing what's coming up in yourself. And that goes both ways, because there is so much that we can learn about ourselves through the process of healing grief. And I feel like one of the first things that you kind of have to do before you can start healing from grief is letting yourself feel it, allowing yourself to feel whatever grief it is. And I think this one in particular is so important when what we're grieving isn't a person, because I think right now it is more widely accepted to be actively grieving a person that we have lost than the other forms of grief, like losing a part of yourself or the grief that comes with an identity shift and things like that. And so, especially around the holidays, there can be a lot of self-reflection, right? I think we can all relate to the fact that winter is a time of really intense self-reflection. It's just that slower time of year when we can come into ourselves and have that internal communication. But a lot of times what happens with that internal communication is it gives us a really good opportunity to look at ourselves and look at what don't I like? What isn't serving me? What do I want to change? So that come springtime, when that energy then begins to start moving outward again, then we're making the physical changes in our world around us based on what our internal reflections have kind of brought up. But when we're in this season of really looking at ourselves and having this time and having this slower pace of life, and even in the holidays and in the chaos that can be the holidays, there is still that intention. The energy in our world is just naturally bringing us more deeply into ourselves, and in that there can be a lot of realizations about, oh, this thing is no longer serving me, and this is no longer fitting, and this is no longer where I want to go. And that's part of why we have New Year's resolutions and things like that. Is we think it's just because of the calendar year, but there's an energetic background to that, and we are in this phase of releasing and letting go. And in that process, there can be a lot of questioning about, why do I feel so sad? Who am I to have this level of grief when, quote unquote, nothing bad has happened, or quote unquote, I haven't lost anything, or all of these kind of qualifiers that we use to determine if we're allowed to feel our feelings. We all have those. We all have our kind of internal barometer for, is this feeling that I'm having a feeling that I'm allowed to have? Is it something that's socially acceptable? Is it something that fits in the guidelines of why other people have felt this feeling before? And as soon as we do that, we've started to think our feelings instead of feel our feelings. And that's where we start to get stuck, because we're suddenly, not only are we dealing with a heavier emotion or a more intense emotion, but now we're also guilting ourselves about feeling that emotion and not letting ourselves feel it. And this is basically creating like an energetic knot inside your energy systems. It's creating this blockage and this resistance within you that's then going to restrict energy flow throughout the entire system, right? Because we are so connected, and we are this basically one long energy flow that has, the different chakras and the meridians and all of these pathways that it uses to flow. But we are here to move energy through our system. And so if there's resistance in one area, it's going to impact all of us. And this is where we start to see a lot of people get really overwhelmed in the holiday season because there's that one emotion that they think they don't have time for, or that they're too busy to have, or that they aren't allowed to have because other people have felt it differently. And suddenly that one little piece of resistance has snowballed because there's so much going on in this season. And so one of the best things that you can do, whether it's grief that you're feeling or something else, is to really just take a moment and sit with yourself. It doesn't have to be long, but really just sit with yourself and ask, how am I feeling right now? If there weren't any expectations, if there wasn't anything to prove, if it was just me by myself feeling my feelings, what am I feeling right now if I'm really honest with myself? And often just that simple act of questioning and getting curious is enough for you to be able to sit and go, you know what? I actually am really sad right now. I am feeling really heavy. I am feeling whatever it is. And if you can even, write that down on a piece of paper and get it out of yourself so that you're not holding on to it, it can be so transformative. And, especially if you have someone that you can talk to about it, even if it's not, an in-depth conversation, but just being like, hey, I'm feeling a little sad right now. I think a lot of times we feel like a burden when we have these kinds of heavier emotions to share. But if you think about it, what we're really doing when we hold on to those things. So let's say that I am experiencing grief in the holiday season, and I'm trying to, be brave and be strong and handle it on my own and work through it by myself so that I'm not a burden to other people, or so that I'm not, appearing weak, or whatever it is the story is in your head of why you need to deal with this emotion on your own. What I'm really doing is I'm keeping it inside myself, and I'm perpetuating the energetic cycle of feeling that emotion and then shoving it down, and feeling the emotion and shoving it down, and it's keeping it going. But as soon as you can get it outside of yourself, whether that's putting it on a piece of paper, talking to a friend, praying, whatever is going to resonate for you to getting it outside of your system, you've broken that cycle. Now you're in a place where instead of shoving that emotion down, now you're acknowledging that emotion. Now you're allowing it to have its space and really honoring this experience that you're having. And I think that that's such an important part of the grieving process, is being able to honor the fact that you are grieving, however that looks for you.
Yes, I agree with all of that. And recognizing, like when you said about feeling guilty, what are the emotions? Because with grief, there can be lots of layers of guilt and feeling judged, judging yourself, a lot of blame. A lot of people tend to, I'm going to use the word victim, like we victimize ourselves, or we victimize our loved one and how they transitioned, or, how they died and what happened. And so retelling the same story again, it keeps that perpetuating that cycle within us. It keeps that story alive, that energy alive. And so there is a period of time when that is very valuable, because we have to speak our truth. So now, going from the heart to our throat chakra, we do have to speak our new truth of how somebody, transitioned, or how what you're doing in life now to deal with it. But at the same time, it's not getting stuck in like a chronic level of grief, which I think in a lot of circumstances it happens in people. And that's where we get stuck in it, and it's years out, and people don't know where to go, who to turn to, how to shift that energy, how to heal that energy within themselves. And I think too, that's really going back to sitting with your emotions, doing the journaling prompts, writing down how you're feeling, putting everything down on paper, doing a fire ceremony if you're about releasing it energetically. I know when I was in the early phases of my grief with my son, I would go to the river, because that was a place that, you're sitting with your emotions. Water represents emotions, the flowing of the water. And I would gather like wildflowers, and I would throw it one at a time, like representing my thoughts or my feelings of connecting with him. We would also release balloons, or I haven't done the lanterns, but I really love that idea. But we would do messages on balloons and release those. And we haven't done that in a long time, but there are so many ways to remember the person who's no longer here as a healing, a way of healing for ourselves, because it's setting up some level of ritual that you are still honoring them and you can still go about life, because the guilty part too is feeling like, how can I still be living when they're no longer here? But if we're here, that's because we still have purpose, we still have work to do, we still have things going on. And I'm a big believer on that, even though I've gone through, all of this grief that I've gone through in my life. But I do believe in our purpose, and that we also have to focus on our life and what we're here to do. My mom recently, so my dad, he died 2 years ago when COVID started and everything. And she just sent out a post recently that talked about, not everyone says we got to get over it, and it's a mountain, and this person's trying to get up and over this mountain, like we have this big thing we got to like achieve and be successful with. But it talks about, well, what if we go around it? What if we go through it? What if we go under, just different ways of releasing grief, moving through grief. And I thought that was really a cool way of looking at it, that it's not just one way, and it's not something we're trying to achieve, and it's not a mountain, even though it feels like that, but it's not necessarily that. It's just really the emotions of what we're processing, which in a lot of ways can be a lot more scarier than even death itself. It's really because we're the ones who are hurting so much that we have to face who we are, how we feel, and who are we going to become at the end of this. Because that's, I think, for a lot of people, what the fear is how and who am I going to become? And so when that comes up, it's like, well, really, on a good positive note of that, you can re-identify yourself. You can recreate yourself. Even though on some levels, like for me, I will say when I lost my son, it was a soul death. It was a death. Like I died that day, but I have re-identified myself. I've regrown into a new person. And even like sitting here having like this would have in my past life, wouldn't be talking about this kind of stuff, but I can honor that this is part of my transition and part of my journey in life. And there have been times when going into grief of identity and missing that part of myself too. And I think that's why having grief conversations is so important, so that people don't think and don't feel alone. Like I'm the
Yes,
only
yes.
one going through this. And it's like, no, you're not. We're all going through it, just in different ways.
Right. And I think that's something that often gets skipped in conversations around grief is the fact that grief is a really integral part of human life. It's not something that, only some people experience. I think everybody can relate to the feeling and experience of grief. And I think when we start to, like we were talking about earlier, qualify our grief or say it's only, valid if it's XYZ circumstances, we're really doing ourselves a disservice because it is part of being alive. We are constantly shifting and transforming and changing. And I have come to see grief as more of a spectrum rather than one emotion for specific experiences, because anytime we make a decision, there is an inherent element of loss to it. Whichever decision we make means that all of the other decisions we could have made, those potentials are behind us now, and we've had to let them go. And for simple choices like what you want for breakfast, the loss of those other potentials isn't a big deal. But when you start looking at, changing who you are, shifting your identity, making big life choices, those come with a lot of personal loss, because what you're really looking at when you're making these decisions is you're looking at all of these different potentials for who you could have been, who you could have become, the life you could have lived. And you have to choose which one is the most aligned with you, which one is the most important. And a lot of times those choices get made for us by life, when we lose someone we love, when we lose a job, when we, et cetera, when we lose something. But there's also that aspect of who we choose to become in the face of that loss, like you were saying, Shantel. And that in and of itself is, again, an incredibly deep process because, and a lot of people who are experiencing grief because of the death of a loved one go through that process of feeling guilty about moving on because it feels like it's no longer honoring and respecting the memory of what they've lost. And I think that feeling, this resistance and this almost torment between these two different versions of ourselves is inherent, whether it's the grief that we're feeling for someone that we've lost or the grief that we're feeling when we're becoming a new person or when we're in the face of that transition. Because again, what we're really doing is we're looking at all these different versions of ourselves and knowing what we know about energy and knowing what we know about our soul's purpose. We have an infinite number of potentials available to us about who we could have become, what we could have done. And yet there's always going to be this one. There's going to be that one thread that runs through it all that we know is what was meant for us, that we know is why we were meant to keep moving forward, that we know is the decision we were meant to make. But just because we know that that's the direction, we know that we need to keep moving, we know that we are somehow on the right path, even if it doesn't feel like it at the time, there's just that internal push toward forward momentum in the face of grief because we know we're meant to keep going. Just because we have that knowing doesn't make it easy. And I think a lot of
Mm-hmm.
people get stuck here in the grieving process is once we've gotten to that place where we can acknowledge it, where we can say, I'm grieving, where we've done a fire ceremony, or, I love to, in the mornings, I wake up and I do 2 pages of just like stream of consciousness writing. Any thought that pops into my head, it goes on the paper. And it's amazing what comes out of your mind when you just let it go and you let it speak. And then you can burn it. Or one of my favorite things to do when I was first going through my grieving process is I would draw a bucket on a piece of paper and I would fill the bucket because I think a lot of times when you're grieving, it just feels like you are carrying too much and you have to put
Mm-hmm.
it down. And so I would draw a bucket and I'd write down all of the things that were filling up that bucket and then I'd burn it or I'd tear it or I'd put it in water or something to get it out. And once we've done that, and once we've kind of felt that forward momentum, that's when these feelings of, but wait, can come in, of those feelings of, am I staying true to this person's memory? Or what about this version of myself that I could have become that I'm leaving behind, et cetera, et cetera. And that's really where my grieving process has come in. And I think it's so funny to talk about grief in the face of a really exciting life transition, like getting engaged. But I think it's something that people don't talk about because it's in the face of these major life transitions that we have to choose to leave a potential of who we could have become behind. And in that
Mm-hmm.
loss, there's going to be this moment of like, but wait, what if? And it's those what ifs that I think catch people in the grieving process, whichever form of grief you're feeling. But it's that moment of realizing what you have lost and what you are leaving behind if you continue to move forward. And so it's this really interesting process of having faith in yourself, having faith in the universe that you are meant to continue, and allowing yourself to put your trust in that to continue to move forward based on that knowing, while also having to allow yourself to let go of what
Yeah.
you're leaving behind. And that dichotomy, I think, is fascinating, both when you're in the grieving process and navigating it yourself, but also just, in the context of this conversation of looking at that process, because I think this is what makes grief so unique, is it's almost like a foundation for any transition. I think grief is such a unique emotion because it's not necessarily something that ever comes on its own. Grief will always show up in the face of change or transition. And so it becomes this foundation and this catalyst for who we choose to become and how we choose to move through that transition. And so it's almost more like white noise in the background than it is this emotion
Mm-hmm.
that's been added on top. And that's what makes it such a unique process and why it's so important to have these conversations, because it's not like sadness or anger or fear where you can just kind of talk your way through it or find the limiting belief or things like that, because it's not that kind of emotion. It's that foundational experience of allowing yourself to have enough hope and trust and faith to move forward while also honoring and respecting and letting go of everything that you're leaving behind and finding that balance for yourself of what is it that is worth it to you to keep moving forward, even when you're having to let these things go. And that's going to look different for every person, which is where, again, I think these conversations are so important, because oftentimes we don't realize this kind of seesaw that we're on when we're in the process of grief, of how far can you lean into the future and into where you're going and into that knowing that you're where you meant to be, while also honoring the process of letting go that needs to happen, and vice versa, of how far can you lean into letting go and honoring that without getting stuck in the past. And so it becomes this balance that, for me at least, and Chantel, I'd love to know your experience, but for me at least, it's almost this, it's not something I can think about. It's not something we can put words to, but it's this internal feeling of being on that precipice for a while, of being in that place of balance. I think grief is a really, I don't want to say fragile state, but it's a very, I almost see it like being on a tightrope. Like you're walking a
Mm-hmm.
tightrope when you're walking the process of grief, because it is so personal and so intricate, and there is such a balancing act between moving forward and letting go.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I know to like right now we're focusing more on the heart chakra of grief, but through my process that I found very interesting is when you it yes, as it can be like you're walking that tightrope, which we are, because it can be a very fragile state of being, right? And if you tilt either way, you can fall, collapse, like the whole world, you're just holding up in the beginning. You're really holding up like a house of cards. And at any point, it can just come crashing down. And I think that there's a lot of fear in that. So when we are moving through grief, I see it as going through all of the chakras and how each one represents different emotions and different experiences. And like I was saying with the throat, where you're speaking a different truth now, or you finally come to the place of understanding, which is going to be more the third eye, the crown chakra, right? Where you see that bigger picture, and then you come out into your solar plexus, which is our self-empowerment again. And for me, I think where I see, because I have established a grief group now called Conscious Grieving. And a lot of people that I see that come through, it's interesting where I see them where you want to say stuck, but not stuck. It's just where they are in that moment, right? But and it's like, okay, I see them where they're in their root. They're not quite sure how to stand up and how to rebuild their foundation, or what their finances look like now that their primary income is gone or their spouse is gone or something. Or they don't know how to speak the truth anymore. They hold on to it and they over speak it. And that's where they're stuck. My story is their story. And so I think as we're moving through the process of it, it's very interesting to see the little like the little light bulbs start flickering back on, and it's like the soul is coming back online. And not that it ever leaves, but we're so inundated with grief and heavy emotions that I think that part of us gets hidden, and we have to protect ourselves. So it's like we put that version of ourselves to the side a little bit to make it through on a physical level, because we're so sensitive to everything. You can be sensitive to people, to sounds, to sights, to experiences, and recognizing that too, and being patient with somebody who's going through the process, whether it is the loss of a loved one or like we're talking identity, because like you're saying, that big spectrum, that's a huge thing to see it like that too, is we're so taught that grief, at least in our society, it's like someone dies and then you're at the funeral and you're back at work in a week and there's just no time for grief. But it really doesn't work like that. And then you have this period of time where it's like, well, you should be over that, like I said earlier. But for some people, it really rips you apart to where you have to rebuild. And if it's a part of you that you are re-identifying and you're on that spectrum, and then at some point, sometimes, and I even experienced this, people don't even recognize who you are anymore. They're like, well, where'd you come from? You used to be this way and now you're that way. And it's like, well, yeah, it shifted me. And I think that's part of our our life's lessons here too with grief, is recognizing how it can shift us. And sometimes it is really that pivoting point that moves us in our life to put us on the right path that we're meant to be on, even though it's a scary part to go through grief. And that is like the catalyst that shifts you onto your journey. But in a lot of ways, that's how that awakening happens. And then just honoring it and feeling and processing it, like you're talking about. Um, and I really actually going back to what you're saying with the seasons, I loved that too. I was thinking about it as you were talking, how we do have to honor the seasons of our earth and everything because it energetically does pull us in. Like we're in winter, it pulls you deep within yourself. Then you're spring, you're growing. Then you're in summer and it's more fun and you're releasing and letting go because it's the sun and all those things. And then you're back into fall, dipping back down and everything. So recognizing those cycles too is really powerful because it doesn't mean you're going into depression or you're going into this level of deep sadness. Sometimes it's just we're going within ourselves because that's the energy in which the earth is pulling us in as well. And it is that death and transformation that we're constantly in flow of.
And I think that's such an interesting thing to look at too, is when we're looking at our energetic reality, it's so easy to forget sometimes how much we are impacted by Earth's energy or the moon or the seasons or all of this. It's all playing a role. And so in those moments where whether it's just a period of big transition and transformation in our own lives, or it is the process of grief or whatever it might be, maybe it's just the busyness of the holidays, it can be really easy to feel really overwhelmed and question, what's wrong with me and what am I doing that I'm feeling this way? Or, like you said, am I going into a season of depression or whatever those fears might be that you start feeling as that mind kind of creeps up in the midst of an intense energetic experience? Remembering that we are we are our own freestanding system, but we are also part of a greater system. We are part
Mhm.
of this energetic experience that everybody calls life. And there are so many factors that are going to influence what that looks like for us. And so that's really where we can come back to, in the midst of these emotions, in the midst of these experiences, what are you doing for your self-care? How are you bringing yourself back into a grounded and centered state? And again, with this conversation being centered around heart chakra, looking at what's going to balance you out. If you are feeling really overwhelmed and chaotic and like your energy is spiraling, what's something you can do that will be calming and grounding? Or if you're feeling really heavy and stuck where you are, what's something you can do that's going to be uplifting and fun? And finding how you interpret your emotions, because it's going to look different for everyone. So, for example, I tend to see my emotions a lot in terms of temperature. It's just how my brain and my energy move through and what makes sense to me. And so I know that there are seasons where if I am depressed, my energy is very cold and very thick. And so what I need is something warm that's going to thaw me. And what that looks like for me, it might be cuddling, it might be reading a book with a cup of tea, whatever is going to bring me into that soft and warm state. And so looking at, what's the opposite of this emotion that I'm feeling right now? What is it that, even if you think of it in terms of color, and I know that my brain processes things very differently than, the person next to me's brain. And so that's where, again, honoring yourself. And I love how much that word has come up in our conversation today, of honoring your experience of how do you understand your emotions? Is it in terms of the chakras? Is it in terms of energy? Is it in terms of temperature or color or just the emotions themselves? And then looking at what will balance that experience, what will bring that experience into harmony, because what we're doing when we are healing, and I've brought this up before because I think it's such a potent example, is we're really on this kind of pendulum swing. If you've ever seen like a grandfather clock or a clock that has a pendulum, is when we're healing, we're on this swing back and forth where we're having a strong emotion and then maybe we're trying to shut it down, or maybe we're looking at it and trying to feel it all right now, and then we swing back to the other side, and we're kind of pushing this pendulum back and forth as we heal. But if we can start to, instead of looking at I need to fix it all right now, or I need to not be feeling this, or I don't have time for this, or whatever it might be, if we start looking at, okay, this is where I am right now, what's going to bring that back into balance? What's going to bring that state of, yin yang harmony into this experience, so that we're not just on one side of the pendulum or the other, but we're really kind of guiding ourselves back into that middle ground where everything can exist. Because a lot of times, these feelings of grief or transition or transformation, they are all consuming. And so if we can even just give ourselves something small that is complementary to the experience that we're having, to the emotion that we're having. So if we are feeling deep sadness, is there even a tiny thing we can do that will bring in a little bit of light? Even if it's, actual light, like lighting a candle, or if it's energetic light, like drawing or reading a new book or standing outside and feeling the air on your face, whatever it is that's going to balance out that experience. And this is where, like Shantel was saying, really looking at your grief or whichever emotion you're feeling and asking, which chakra am I in most right now in terms of this emotion? Is it that I'm in a place where I'm having to redefine my foundation and look at my financial stability and look at my home environment and changing that around? Or is it that I'm in a place where I'm having to redefine who I am and kind of having to reintroduce myself to myself and figure out, who am I now in the midst of this change? Or are you in a third eye place of learning to see the bigger picture and looking at, it from a more spiritual perspective of, why is this happening? Or am I in a space where it's throat chakra and I'm learning to have the courage to speak about it and to let this be my new truth? Really looking at, which chakra are you most identified with right now, knowing that that could change in an instant. But if we give ourselves this tool of looking at our grief, it also gives us this opportunity and this potential for healing it, because now we can look at, okay, I'm in throat chakra, so I really want to make sure that I am drinking a lot of water, keeping that energy clear, that I'm maybe singing or chanting or doing something to activate that throat chakra. And then looking at its, kind of chakra counterpart of which chakra is it mirrored with. So, throat chakra is very much mirrored with solar plexus of, what is your identity and what is that why and that I am that you're speaking from, and making sure that the words you're saying are staying true to your identity and that you know who you are and you're aligned with your values and you're really solid in yourself. And that can go both ways, if even if you're in a third eye chakra perspective of looking at that bigger why and finding that bigger picture, bringing it back down into sacral, which is that, kind of mirrored counterpart, and looking at that deeper, more water-based element of coming back into yourself and creating, so that now that you have this why big picture image, what are you going to do with that? How are you going to bring it back into this physical reality? How are you going to manifest that understanding in your life around you? That kind of thing. When we look at grief through the chakras, or any strong emotion through the chakras that way, and we really pinpoint, this is the one that I am in right now, and giving ourselves that permission to transition out of it whenever we're ready, it gives us this opportunity and this really kind of clear, not quite step-by-step guide to healing grief, but it gives us an opportunity to be present with it and to know, what do I need now and now and now in this process, knowing that it is a process, but we can help ourselves through it by coming back into that idea of maintaining harmony in the system and being true to where we are and honoring the emotion that we're having, while also allowing it to continue to process and not get stuck.
Yes, I love that. Especially with when you're talking about the pendulum, what I was actually seeing is that when we are swinging from one side, one extreme to the other, what ends up happening too is we start layering on different masks, so to speak, different layers of ourself. And then what ends up happening is we have to unlayer all that. We have to re-unpack. So it's like, it can be very, a lot of work. Grief can be a lot of work when we're just packing on layers to protect ourselves or to not want to feel. And so when we are in our chakras and we're having that identifying where we can say, okay, I'm feeling this and this is where it's at. This is the emotion I'm feeling. This is the layers that I'm feeling and why, and so to me, it's just so important that these conversations are being had, because I think a lot of people just don't know. And so even that right there, like go into your chakras, recognize the emotions, recognize the organ systems of our body that are attached to each chakra. And that can really help people identify what they're feeling, the illnesses that they're feeling. Why are they suddenly having, digestive issues or heart issues or, a lot of headaches? And when you can connect that back to your chakra system, back to the emotions that we're holding onto, we're blocking this energetic block that's happening, and then it starts to manifest into a physical illness. Unpacking all of that and unlayering it starts to heal the body because we're energetically healing, we're emotionally healing. And I think it's really important that people are aware of that, because otherwise, when you're just out there grieving, whatever the grief is that you're grieving, people get lost. They're like, I don't know what to do with all of this. And so that's why I think a lot of people get stuck in anger. They get stuck in all these other emotions that aren't, each emotion has a benefit. But when you get stuck in those lower, more denser, emotions, that isn't really helpful in life to get us moving. It's not getting our inner, our flow back. And so recognizing it on an energetic chakra level, I think, is so important. And then also it gives you a place to go, a place to kind of get your mind off. You can start learning different things about yourself, how to be processing it all, and really coming back to self-love and self-care. And so that is so important as well. When we're talking about honoring ourselves, it's really about taking the time to self-love, to understand who you are, to take care of yourself. If you need to go rest and take a bubble bath, if you need to go and you're talking coloring or painting, being creative, sitting in nature, whatever it is, but it is really about letting ourselves be nurtured by ourselves. And I think that's when our higher self gets to come in and really connect to the physical body of who we are, because we're not just um, focused in on the physical, but then the spiritual connection starts to evolve. And I think that really happens for a lot of people that are moving through grief in a way that allows them to reconnect to the true essence of who they are. So at the end of it, not that there's really an end, but at some point, then people really recognize they've had this huge spiritual growth within themselves that you don't even expect at the beginning, because at the beginning you're just like kind of facing the dirt, right? You're just all physical, and then suddenly, at some point you recognize that you've transitioned in this whole different person, and now you have this spiritual side of yourself that wasn't there before. And that's just such a, lack of a better word, a beautiful way of transforming. I see that as like the butterfly emerging from the chrysalis and spreading the wings and being able to recognize, and on a spiritual level, knowing our loved ones are here, they are surrounding us. I think that they're there just cheering us on, like, you did it. Because I don't believe that they're over there feeling any of the things we're feeling. We're
Right.
over here, we're suffering through it all. And they're kind of like, we're moving on, doing our next step, our next thing, or whatever we do on the spiritual side. But for us, that's where the heart really comes in and has attachments and anchors and all these things that we it's important to kind of let go of too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think when, again, like we've been saying about that aspect of harmony and balance and kind of helping pull yourself out of it, is really looking at, again, the energetic signature of grief is very heavy and huge, and you get lost in it, and it's really fluid, and there's no real boundaries, and everything just feels so overwhelming. And so coming back to what's something you can do to create some structure in that, is it looking at looking at grief through the lens of the chakras and bringing structure in that way, so that you have at least one thing that you can do today to activate your throat chakra. And then what's something that you're doing to kind of pull yourself out of it, to give yourself a space where that's not all you're thinking, even if you have to kind of Force yourself to do it a little bit at first. That's okay. It doesn't mean that you're doing anything wrong. It just means that you're creating a new energetic experience. And so, is that painting? Is it reading a book? Is it going out in nature? Is it taking a shower? What is it that's going to lift you up out of it, even just a little bit? And then looking at those elements of self love, coming back to the beginning of this conversation when we were saying that grief is just all of that love that we didn't get to express. Can you allow yourself to express that love for yourself? As in, have you showered today? Have you eaten? Have you had something warm to drink? Have you gone for a walk? Have you moved your body? Can you put on a shirt or an outfit that's really comfortable or soft? Do you have a blanket that you can sit with? No matter how deeply you are in your grieving process, those basic things are always going to help, even if it is, the grief of a self transition or the grief of losing a person. It doesn't matter where on the spectrum of grief you are. These basic things really are going to help lift you up and make you feel better, because what you're doing with those moments when you are taking a shower or doing your hair or getting yourself something to eat or whatever it might be, what you're doing is you are subconsciously telling yourself that you are worth continuing to move forward, that there is hope for what comes next. And again, no matter where you are on the spectrum of grief, that is going to be incredibly important, especially as we move into the holidays where time becomes a little thinner and maybe we have more filling up our schedules. Coming back to those basics of what structure are you giving yourself today? Even if it's just a simple, I'm going to be done working by 5 p.m., or I know that I'm in throat chakra and I'm going to do one activating action for my throat chakra today. Whatever structure you need to give yourself to help ground back into your present experience, coupled with what are you doing for yourself today? Have you showered? Have you eaten? Are you wearing something comfortable? Letting yourself be, and then giving yourself that experience of even just that little reminder that there is hope. There is something to look forward to. I believe in myself enough to do this thing and keep moving forward. And it's amazing how much even just those little things help in the face of this process. And knowing too that in this process, if you need someone to kind of walk through it with you, if you want someone to be there to help you through the process, someone who has been through their own grieving process and can see from the outside where you're at and where you're wanting to go and can help guide you through that, know that both Shantel and myself do have that experience and are more than happy to hold that space for you. We have these conversations in our courses as well. This comes up all the time because, again, grief is not something that just a few people experience. Grief is a universal experience, and we can help each other through it. We can help uplift each other. We can set those structures in place when we need something to hold on to. We can lift each other up, etc. And so if you're feeling like you're lost or you're stuck or you don't know where to go or you're feeling overwhelmed or the holidays are just not your time of year, reach out to us, send us an email, leave us a comment, find us on Facebook, join the community Facebook group, all of these things. And we are more than happy to support you, whether that's in a group container like the Facebook community or it's in a one-on-one session where we're connecting and we're really looking at what's your situation, what are your emotions, how can we help you release what you're ready to release, process what you're ready to process, and really step into your higher self and into that fullest version of yourself, because that's really what we're here to do.
Yes, yes, yes. And I love that they're just sending out that like that life that the life vest of like, come, and if you need support, please, we're here to do this. And I love holding space for people who are grieving, because it isn't, even though it is universal, like you're saying, it's so true, but at the same time, it's so individual that I really like to be able to hold space for people and to help them, mentor them through that, or just listen, just being there to listen, because sometimes that's all it is. And the one thing I did want to mention is you kind of touched on it, but just expand a little bit more on the spectrum of colors. Colors is a big thing, because even in grief, technically the color's black, but it's not. That's just, I think but at the same time, when we wear certain colors, it's going to help us to vibrate at a different layer, a different level as well. We'll be on that spectrum, that resonance of what that color represents. And so sometimes it's just waking up too and looking in your closet and picking out some colors that might help you get through the day, because it's a great visual for the day to remind you of what you were feeling in the morning or what your intention is throughout your day. If you're wearing pink or you're wearing red or yellow or whatever. Um, so you're more external than you are internal. And sometimes we need that too. That's what pulls us through, is to have that just visual of what we're wearing. And it doesn't mean you can't have your favorite, like I wear black all the time. That's just my color. But when I am really feeling like I need to express myself in a different way, wearing a colorful shirt is really going to help do that. It's going to set that intention. And so I just wanted to put that out there too. Surround yourself with different colors in your home when you're grieving, and see if that sparks any uplift in your life, if that opens up your heart a little bit more, if that brings laughter, or if that brings any layer of joy in your heart, just by seeing a different color, or being active in that. And so with grief, there comes these little things that we can add to actually, like milestones, to show us where we've been and where we are. And always celebrating those little wins too, because it's big, every little tiny step will add up to where now you've transitioned into a whole different spectrum of yourself. And sometimes we just get lost in that and we don't recognize it. And so really honoring ourselves again, celebrating our little wins and our steps. And yeah. And like
Yeah.
Izzy said, we are here. We're here to support and to listen and communicate with you all.
Yeah, absolutely. We truly are here, whether that's in the Facebook group or in Messenger or via email. We are here to hear you, to witness you through this process and through whatever emotions you're experiencing. And so I'm going to make a little post in the Facebook group where we can celebrate our wins, even if it's something small, like I got out of bed this morning, or something huge, like, I just bought a new house. Whatever your win looks like today, tomorrow, next week, whatever it is, let's celebrate it together, because like Shantel said, it's so important. Those little wins are really what are going to lift us up, what are going to keep us moving forward. And when we can celebrate each other, that energy is just going to amplify, and we're going to be able to lift each other up. And that is really what it's all about. So thank you all so very much for coming to today's conversation, listening in. We are incredibly grateful for all of you, and know that we are here for you, for your process, for your emotions, all of it. And thank you all so much, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you. Have a good day.